everybody, welcome back, friends of the English literature. So, in my last few videos we talked about the relationships between India and Britain during the period of colonization, during the Victorian Empire, and we explained the relationship between native people and British people. We also mentioned and analyzed the work by Edward Morgan Foster, which was Passage to India, that was actually based on that relationship between British people and native people, so people who had to suffer from the idea of imperialism of the British Empire that wanted to impose a very specific code, moral code that was very strict, that wanted to impose values, manners, and those ideals of the patriarchal family that belonged to the English middle class of the time. Now, today we're going to talk about a very, very famous writer and author that actually belonged to both traditions. So he can be considered British, but he can also be considered Indian, as probably he considered himself. I'm talking about Rudyard Kipling, okay? He was born in 1865 and died in 1936. Actually, he was born just 7 years after the mutiny in Bombay. In his work in general, that was huge, okay? His works were so many and full of experimentations and full of contents and very interesting to analyze. We can say that his work in general is based on 3 focus points, okay? The first one is the exploration of India in all its aspects, not only as a country, okay, so sort of a physical exploration, but especially from a human perspective and a very, we can say, emotional perspective. Then the second focus point is obviously his style and his affection for fairy tales. Okay, so these fairy tales in which human beings and animals played together. They were mixed up. Most of the times the animals played the roles that usually should belong to human beings. And finally, the third point is a sort of a filing, okay, of modern neuroses, okay, of the modern alienation, which was in huge part due to the approach of the First World War. Well, Kipling was born in India, and India was considered the Eden of his childhood. So pure and contaminate, and in fact his first language was Hindi actually. His parents were Wesleyan but secularized, and they forced him to go back to England when he was a child, so he spent a long period in India from the age of 6 to the age of 16, and that was the opposite, I mean, in his mind it was complete opposite of the period he spent in India. So if India was the Eden, England was the hell of his childhood, of his youth in this case. In fact, it was considered sort of a desolated home, and in this period he substituted religion with Freemasonry, and this is something that belongs also to his experience in India. In fact, he comes back to India and he spends there another long period between the age of 17 and 24. And in this period, he develops his profession of journalist. So he becomes a journalist. He studies journalism. By the way, I'm talking about India now, but the place where he lived at the time should now called Pakistan, actually. Anyway, at the age of 24, he came back to England again for the last time, but he also traveled a lot to Japan, to America, to Canada, Vancouver, so he traveled actually a lot. In 1907, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Then he suffered for a huge loss because his son was missing in action during the First World War. As I said before, he died in 1936, and he was buried in the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. He was actually very well known at the time, very famous and well considered by the intellectual environment. His work was really it was absolutely huge, and there was a variety of styles, interpretations, and different contents. So let's start to analyze his work. So first of all, he wrote both poetry and prose. He was a self-taught author, and sometimes he is compared to Dickens because he learned from both imitation, especially imitation of Poe, Emerson, and he also learned from his profession, his work, his job as a journalist. So journalism also taught him a lot about writing. He considers himself a stranger, okay? He doesn't consider himself British, and that is the reason why he sees England from an external point of view. There's a strong criticism towards England, and he's quite objective. As I said before, he considered himself both British and England, probably, like Orwell, like Thackeray, for example. And he, in his works, he always represents that alienation, that uneasiness of native people that are oppressed by colonialism. His literature is a literature of the border. On the border and off the border. In fact, he talks about borders. Actually, he lives on the border. Borders between ethnic groups, borders between men and animals, and most of the times, as I said before, animals live on a higher level compared to man, to the human being. Border between being and not being. Actually, he was a poet, but he was also an anthropologist, and his double nature made his work very special. He also studied metalinguistics, and we find the result of his studies also in his works, especially because India at the time contained a great variety of languages with English, Hindi, and many other dialect and languages, so that was also very interesting. He put great attention to style, and technique, basically. He completely he hated the idea of aestheticism. But some people describe him as a mannerist in his emphasized rejection of mannerism. So the idea, the idea of emphasizing mannerism so strongly made him basically a mannerist. Okay, his art is considered is called the art of fiction, and is very, very particular. In fact, in his fiction there are some features that are almost always the same. So there is just one great important event in the plot. Other events aren't considered that much, and the situation, the context, important facts around aren't described at all. There are just a few characters and very long, very detailed descriptions. As I said before, no context, and the situation that was the main element of the plot is a quite complicated situation, as it is the syntax. which is quite strange, quite complicated. There's a lot of experimentation there. As I said before, he wrote novels, but he wrote many short stories, more than 200 short stories, which are actually a lot. And there were a lot of experimentations there, experimentations that changed the plot. This is why we can say that he was a sort of an existentialist ante litteram, okay? And he also experimented some techniques that will belong to modernism, when the traditional plot, the plot of the traditional novel of the British middle class, collapses and is completely substituted by a new idea of plot: first person, singular, interior plot, monologues, free association, stream of consciousness, and so on and so on. So there are really a lot of experimental efforts in his works. Some people say that he belonged to the so-called tragic generation. So it means that basically he expressed and he embodied also a strong pessimism. We can say that he was a very muscular, a very strong novelist, and he believed in the so-called sentimental imperialism. The sentimental imperialism was a very specific way of considering the empire and colonialism in general. So Orwell said about Kipling that he didn't believe in the ideology of power. In fact, he rejected the idea of totalitarianisms in Europe. Obviously, they were growing up in this period, and he refused that idea of power. He believed in the idea of an empire that shouldn't be economical or political, but that was the idea of an empire that represented responsibility in front of God. And that led to important interior qualities, like, for example, discipline, self-discipline, or dignity. Well, there are obviously many interpretations of his so different works and a variety of works and themes he touched. Interpretations that may concern Marxism, or also Freudian interpretations, even interpretations that are connected to the idea of post-structuralism. Then some people say that he may have been homosexual. For sure, we know that he was a misogynist. This was quite clear, okay? That's probably the only thing that we can know for sure, actually. Talking about his works, I can actually mention all of his short stories. All of his works are really so many, but I choose the most representative ones. So first of all, in 1887, he wrote Plain Tales from the Hills. Plain Tales from the Hills talks about India, obviously, and colonialism as an unnatural element, an unnatural power. It's very disillusioned, very cynical, actually, quite experimental, actually. There is no specific style here. He uses a first-person narrator and different dialects, quite simple style, but with those different dialects and experimentations inside. Then he wrote two works, Departmental Ditties and Life's Handicap, that talk about a military environment, okay, a military topic. Obviously, I shall remember here that the World War I was approaching, and so this topic was quite modern and important at the time. And then again, many inventions, full of fantasies. It's quite dreamlike, and it contains also hallucinations. So it's a very fantastic work. And The Day's Work. The Day's Work is a satire against American, basically, but he also talks about a new topic concerning technologies, so modern technologies. Talking about novels, especially, we can mention The Light That Failed. That was the first slightly autobiographical novel. It talked about an artist, painter, Dick, that became blind, and he suffered because he was in love with a woman who was also a painter. Okay, her name was Maisie, and she was an orphan. Yes, we can say that this work has the first autobiographical features, but actually it wasn't considered so great by the critics, and considered quite superficial and monotonous. Then, Captain's Courageous. Okay, this is more famous actually. This is a real exhibition of language, okay, a style of language. And at the same time, it also talks about quite an important message, which is that money isn't that important after all for the human being, or shouldn't be that important. Then, one of his most famous novels, Kim. Kim is actually an autobiographical novel. It is obviously full of fantastic elements. It is absolutely idealized, but it starts from a very autobiographical element. So it talks about a sort of an Indian Kipling. He is orphan, abandoned, so this idea of abandonment in his life is quite recurring. And this kid doesn't want to grow up. This isn't a new topic, actually. We know about other authors, like Barry, for example, in Peter Pan, who talked about this kid that didn't want to grow up, which is also quite symbolic, quite allegoric. Even though this is can be connected to the idea of a picaresque novel anyway. An important theme is, in this case, agnosticism. Okay, this is quite strong in his work. Then, again, we are all waiting for this. So, the two Jungle Books. Okay, well, most of the times we talk about just one Jungle Book, but there are two of them. The first Jungle Book is formed by 7 fairy tales, okay? Only the first 3 of them talk about Mowgli, okay, and his adventures. 3 of them, because the first one is about the newborn Mowgli, and then the second one is about Mowgli as a kid, and the third one as an adolescent. Only 3 of them. The other 4 are about different topics. So the white seal, okay, and the mongoose. The mongoose, Rikki Tikki Tavi, okay, that's the name of the mongoose. It's quite famous, okay. Now, back to Mowgli and his adventures. The world in which he lives is a sort of a, or better, represents a sort of a reversed perspective, okay, where the animals play the role of the human being, and society is led by animal, and that society is more moral, okay, than the human one. So they recognize the man as a weak creature, and for this reason they don't kill man, okay. So it's a sort of a fair play, okay. It's a sort of a moral and ethic perspective of society and power and the use of power. Mowgli is abandoned again. You see that this topic is very, very recurring, actually. So like Kipling, or the way in which Kipling perceived himself. And he goes back to the level of the beast. But pay attention, this going back doesn't mean going backwards, okay? On the contrary, because it's a sort of he reaches a sort of a primordial state which is on a higher level than the human state in the modern society. Okay, this is very important. This is why Mowgli is quite reluctant in going away, leaving the jungle and going back to the village. So there are a few characters here who are quite symbolic. Bagheera, for example, she is the contrary, okay, compared to Mowgli, because Mowgli was a man grown up in an animal environment, and what Bagheera was grown up by man, okay? So she knew everything about the human being, everything about the risks of living with man, and also the necessity of living with man for a young man, actually. Then there's another part that concerns the education of the bear, okay, Baloo. And there are the monkeys. The monkeys here represent the lowest level of society, the complete lack of morality, of sense of duty. This is quite, this is the contrary of what Darwin said, okay? So this is really a way to defy Darwin's perspective and idea about monkeys. And then there is Ka. Ka is sort of a parody of the Gothic element. Most of the times we think that the story ends when Mowgli gets back to the village, or better, gets to the village for the first time. Probably because the movie, Disney movie, ends at this point, but it's not true. So Mowgli starts to live in the village, is integrated there, then he kills the tiger, and for this reason he is accused of using sorcery, and so he has to escape, and he gets back to the jungle, which is a shelter for him, and he starts his life again at the border. We are again to the border here. He gets married again, but his life will always be divided, okay, and split into two, okay, because of these two worlds that can't coexist, actually. Well, the second Jungle Book is less famous. It is formed by 8 long tales, which are considered quite monotonous, actually. This is probably why they weren't particularly successful. They talk about the Arctic environment, and then Brahman that becomes a beggar. And then Kipling goes back to Mowgli again, but in this case there is an alternative view of this world in which violence plays an important role, and so the Eden is destroyed here, and we are back to the idea of the human violence. There's so many other short stories. I can mention all of them. I will mention just a couple of works that are very, very, very important. One of them, which is quite famous, is Just So Stories. Just So Stories is literature for kids. Okay, really, this time. Full of verses and rhymes and puns. And it also gives an alternative version, okay, of the biblical Genesis, basically. The most famous tale in this work, this collection of tales, is The Cat That Walked by Himself, in which he talks about this legend and this sort of a parable about this cat and the reason why cats are still independent, okay, differently from dogs or other animals. Then another work, Puck of Pook's Hill, is another work, very particular work in this case, because it's connected to ancient legends, especially the Nibelungs and the Arthurian legends, okay, which are basically a part of the British culture and history and literature, obviously. Also in this case, characters are absolutely fantastic. There is also strong reference to Shakespeare, and particularly to Midsummer Night's Dream, to his work, to his comedy. So there are many different literary references that can be quite interesting, and they are also an example of experimentation. As I said before, there are many other works and a variety of experimental interpretations, but we can say that the main themes and the main styles of Kipling were described now by the works we have mentioned. So this way of interpreting India, and not only as a colony, and so this this idea of colonialism full of criticism, but India also as a setting and an environment that could allow him to use symbolism, to use animals as a symbol of an alternative to the human society in which he didn't feel fitting, and in fact there is a lot of Kipling's life, I mean, in his works, and there is also a lot of what was going on in his period as far as society was concerned and the human perspective of life was concerned. We were approaching modernism. He experimented a lot, and he was really feeling the we can say the weight of alienation and the alienating developments of society that were actually changing literature and changing life and changing the perspective of the human being forever. This is why Kipling is such a great and famous and eternal author. I hope that this video has been interesting for you. If you have any questions, you know, you can contact me, you can write me, leave me a message, a comment below. Please don't forget to subscribe my channel and to share this video if you like it. And I hope to see you very, very, very soon again with English literature. Thank you for watching. Bye!